everybody. Rita McGrath here, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined virtually by Dean Carignan and JoAnn Garbin, who are the co-authors of this terrific book, Innovation at Microsoft, which provides 7 case studies and a bunch of best practices that they've learned through the course of fostering innovations at a company that's now 50 years old, or soon will be 50 years old, and a bit of an anomaly, right? So my own research suggests that your typical large Fortune 500 company gets acquired, goes out of business, or otherwise disappears after about 40 to 50 years. That seems to be the trajectory that most companies are on. And this company has managed to, so far, avoid that fate. So I'm very curious to learn about how that works and to share with you the interesting ideas from this book. So perhaps JoAnn and Dean, maybe each give a little overview of your background and how you came to be interested in writing this book.
Sure. Go ahead,
JoAnn,
Dean.
you want to go first?
No, you go ahead. We'll go alphabetical.
Okay. Sure. So Dean Carignan, currently work in the office of the chief scientist at Microsoft. This is my 20th year at Microsoft, so I've been here for a good portion of the company's 50-year history. Have done a variety of roles, including product, marketing. Came to the office of the chief scientist to focus on AI because I saw that as just such a important and fast-moving area. Prior to Microsoft, I was a consultant with McKinsey and Company, did an MBA at INSEAD, and then before getting into the business world, I worked in international economic development. I was with the World Bank and with USAID.
Wow, that's a very interesting journey.
Indeed.
And it's one of the things that we like to highlight that makes our book a bit different because we have very different backgrounds. Whereas Dean has largely been an entrepreneur, I've spent most of my career as an entrepreneur, building or helping other people build companies. I've been in corporate twice, once because my company got bought, and once because Microsoft kept asking. My last role was the director of innovation in the cloud business of Microsoft. I led our regenerative data center of the future program. And about a year in, I met Dean, and we just started talking innovation as two people that had been practicing it for years. And we started trading stories, and we're like, hey, we're very different, but we've had a lot in common. So my journey doesn't have as many big names or milestones to point to other than I always measure my success as I've always paid my mortgage and I've created a lot of jobs. So.
That's wonderful. Well, we need that in this day and age. We absolutely do. So the book that we're talking about is called The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. It is a very attractive book, which I have right here with me. And I should mention that all the proceeds of this are going towards an educational foundation. So maybe say a few minutes about that, just so our listeners know what their book buying dollars will be contributing to.
Yeah, it was really important to us that this book was a tool and it got out into as many hands as possible. So very early on, we talked about removing the profit aspect of it for us. We didn't want people to debate whether to buy the book and somehow whatever the thought process may be. So we haven't picked any one particular charity, but we're going to send all proceeds to education, nonprofits, creating the next generation of change makers. And we're really focusing on STEAM, not STEM. And the reason being, as you'll see in the book, the arts are just as important as science and math and technology.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. That's great. So go out and buy the book, guilt-free, if you're innovators. But I think, as someone who spent like a ton of time in innovation, one of the things that I would observe is most of us have not been trained in what innovation really is. And there's so many myths about it. It's sort of Steve Jobs arrives, in a black turtleneck on a clamshell and miracles happen. And, so I guess
about right.
So, and if you think about the life cycle of a competitive advantage, right, it begins with innovations. It begins with people doing new things. Then you have the opportunity to scale it up. And then you have this, if you're lucky, long period of being able to exploit that innovation. And then the world moves on, the old advantage goes away, and you need to do some reinvention. And most companies don't do that very successfully. So I'd love to get your take on what is it you think about Microsoft, maybe about its culture, maybe about its leadership. And you make a big point that innovation really does require courageous leadership in many cases to pull off. So what to you are some of the elements of the secret sauce there?
Yeah, I can take a stab, JoAnn, and then so I think this is the question that in many ways motivated us to write the book, because we looked at Microsoft and its 50-year history, and in that time you can point to at least 4 distinct reinventions when the fundamental paradigm of technology changed and Microsoft had to recreate itself to stay relevant. We're in the midst of the 4th reinvention right now, which is AI. So we get to see it up close and live through it and experience it. But I think a couple of things have helped the company to do this. One has been simply the fact that we've done it before. I remember when I started at Microsoft, we were kind of going through the pivot into competing in search against Google. And it seemed fundamentally impossible. And a very tenured CVP came in to talk to our group. And he basically said, we've been in situations like this before. We've navigated it. We've succeeded. So having models to build on and having seen it done in the past is a big component. I think mission clarity is another element. It's the fact that our mission has been very consistent throughout all 50 years. And so there's kind of a North Star to pivot back to, help every person and organization in the world to achieve more. There have been variants of it, but it's been pretty consistent. And then a lot of it, I think, is also culture. We have a culture of supportive leadership, of risk-taking, of swinging for the fences. And I think that encourages people to take on the risk that is needed when you actually do have to make one of these big changes and pivots. But I'm sure JoAnn has some other thoughts to add to that.
I'll focus on one, which is the premise, a disbelief we're trying to, or a belief we're trying to dispel, that innovation is the realm of a few gifted technical gurus.
Yeah.
And when you look across the case studies of Microsoft and the history, and you talk to all the people, you find every department, every role, every level of the company involved. And so innovation, both the output is more than technology, and the people creating the change and the value are also more than technologists. And we feel strongly that, we're both engineers. We learned a lot about collaboration and problem solving in our educational environments. And it was focused more directly on, you can innovate, but a lot of programs don't teach that to people, that you too are an innovator. This is another reason we include the arts in this, because artists and musicians and theater folk, they all also get the message that they're innovators. We need to get finance and marketing and all of the other roles at the front line, all the way out into the fields, everything. Everybody needs to believe they have a role to play in the process. And so the book demonstrates that. We tried to highlight all of the different aspects of innovation.
I love that.
Maybe could I, if I could build on that, because there's another element of both the book and Microsoft. One of the roles or personas in innovation that we identified through the book is what we call boundary crossers. And these are people who work across organizational boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, sometimes geographic boundaries. And what we found was that was absolutely essential to the innovative process, because it often starts very far upstream, has a scientific or technological breakthrough, but it's not really an innovation until it's made its way out into the world to customers and is delivering value. And so I've really found Microsoft has more boundary crossers than any company I've worked in or with. And we really, I think, we invest in people. And a good example is I'm an engineer, 15 years in engineering, but now for 5 years, I've worked in the office of the chief scientist. And so that wouldn't happen in a lot of companies, but Microsoft encourages that. And so when you get that cross-fertilization and that collaboration, the ability for invention to mature into a true innovation is much higher. And so I think that that role of boundary crossers is really important and somewhat unique within Microsoft.
It is interesting. So I talk a lot about people that I call Sherpas.
Yes, exactly.
If you want to go climb Mount Everest, you better bring a Sherpa with you, because they're going to know, oh, it's Tuesday, and we're not going that way.
Exactly.
And I think there's a little understood role that a lot of companies struggle with, which is, you've got your main business and it's moving forward at 80 miles an hour, and it's big and it's got its own logic, and there's people who are very invested in its success. And your new little thing is on the on-ramp, and it's tiny in many cases, and it's sort of irrelevant, and it hasn't quite got its business model figured out. And is this thing going to make us money or not? We don't know. And so how do you bring those two together is often one of the big places where I see innovation efforts just come to nothing, because they just can't navigate that sort of growing up of a business into something that needs to scale and needs to be mature.
This is something we write about. It. We have a pattern there where we call it innovate with everyone. And the crux of that pattern is that you might have a great idea, but you're going to need many other people and groups to actually get it out into the world. And some people are good at that, and others are not. Sometimes you need not only the inventor, but the innovation champion to shepherd it, or in your word, be the Sherpa for it. One anecdote from the book that I love is Eric Horvitz, who's our chief scientist, who I work for, ran Microsoft Research for many years. And he said his goal in hiring researchers was to look for people who had horsepower and rudder. Horsepower to do great breakthrough scientific thinking, but rudder to direct it into, applied positive outcomes for products and for our customers. And if you go walk the halls of Microsoft Research today, you really see that great scientific minds who also want to have impact, in the real world.
And what comes to mind for me is the second pattern, innovating over the years. We use the analogy metaphor of daily business is the river, right? Flowing straight ahead, going path of least resistance, where innovation is an ocean. It's a current. There is a current, but things swell and crash, right? And we talk about, we use a lot of different imagery in the book to try to tell the stories of how the different groups have managed bringing the ocean to the river instead of the river to the ocean. And one of the big ideas from the book is oftentimes in innovation, we've come to this point where we talk about start small. And that's true, except first you have to paint a big picture. If you don't paint something big enough and transformational enough, you can't keep the energy of people engaged long enough to get there. Like little things get lost and misplaced and looked over. Whereas when you have this big horizon to look at, it fuels you, especially through the challenging parts. But then the key is you can't just keep talking about the big picture. You have to build stepping stones. We need those small steps that lead the path to the big picture. And that's how you can bring the ocean into the river instead of the other way around.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. I am, I think it's hard, innovators, some people trying to do innovation get very invested in the big vision, and they don't think enough about, okay, at a granular level, what does that mean Joe has to do this afternoon? And so you really do need both. And I think there's a skill to it, a real skill. So one of the things that comes up a lot when I talk to people involved in innovation is that, failure comes with the territory. Not a lot of what you try isn't going to work out the way that you expected. It's unpredictable, right? You can't put it on a schedule and say, by next Thursday, this is what's going to happen, the way you can in the core business, right? Because you've ironed out all that uncertainty. So how do you, as leaders of innovation, think a little bit about that? And let me just tell our readers, those who just joined us, I'm here talking to JoAnn Garbin and Dean Carignan about their terrific book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft, and trying to unpack some of the secrets of how this pretty successful and, company with something of a reputation for at times being kind of arrogant, kind of, pushing people around, how that company has managed to kind of rethink and reinvent itself. So let's talk a little bit about this prospect of things not working out.
Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful anecdote in the book from Julia Liusin, who runs our developer division. They build all our tools for software developers. And she really encourages people to use very precise vocabulary when they're talking about innovation, and in particular, the word hypothesis. And when you start to say, I have a hypothesis and I'm going to test it, a negative outcome is not a failure, it's a learning opportunity. And the way she described it to us, just introducing that vocabulary made people feel a lot more comfortable with exploratory work, because even if you don't achieve the desired outcome, you've validated or invalidated a hypothesis, you've learned, and you can move on. And so very small sort of language-based things like that can create the environment in which people feel more comfortable taking risk.
And the very first pattern in the book, we talk about how, innovating every day, how to make it continuous, reliable, scalable, repeatable, learnable. And I've always liked this saying that I get a little wrong every time I use it, but the sentiment is, when you start exploring a hypothesis or trying to solve a problem, you may not know how you're going to solve it, but you know how you're going to go about solving it. And there's the difference. We're not ever going to be, it's oxymoronic to say the outputs of innovation are going to be repeatable and predictable, but the process of innovation can be. Here's where we're at. You can communicate. We're in the earliest stages right now. So it's going to be really loopy. We're going to crash and burn. We're going to learn a ton. And then as you move forward into higher fidelity and getting, converging on what the eventual thing or solution may be, then you can have different metrics and you have different communication and you have different people in it. And by laying out all of that, which I've literally seen innovators shudder when I say the word structure, but if you think of the structure of innovation process and methodology and practice as scaffolding, not walls, any designer or artist will tell you those constraints, those things are supportive, not constrictive.
Absolutely.
And so but it requires you to know where you're going from a process and method standpoint, not an endpoint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe to add, there's a few other practical things that some teams shared with us when we interviewed. One is, it's one team that has a monthly gathering. They call it Failure to Lunch. And it's a play on failure to launch. Of course, they get together for lunch and they have 2 or 3 people get up and talk about an effort that didn't work out, but what they learned from it. And they celebrate the fact that people took risk and learned and now are building on those learnings. Another group changed the employee review process to look both at the quality of decisions that were made to do something risky, as well as the outcome. And that really shifted the review process in a way that people realized they could be rewarded for making a very good decision, a very good investment, risky investment, even if the outcome was not what they hoped for. So all these little tactical practices seem to kind of ladder up to a broader culture where people feel comfortable taking risk and trying new things.
Which is a huge impediment in a lot of companies, because people feel, if I step out of my nice, safe corporate swim lane and take on something that might not work out, if it doesn't work out, it's the end of my career, or if my project doesn't move forward, I'm done here and I'll have to go somewhere else. And I'd love to know how people feel about their careers in the context of joining an innovative effort that might not work out. So maybe something like the mobile phone thing, which was fascinating to me as a case study, because you had two efforts going on at the one time. And I'd love to know some behind the scenes of this. So there was the Project Pink, the phone that eventually became the flip phone, that got kind of caught up in internal competition and never really made it out to the world.
Yeah. One thing I'd love to say, and we do write about mobile in the book, our sort of analysis there is in that case, Microsoft didn't take enough risk. We basically did embrace kind of a paradigm of a phone that was largely a small computer, a small PC. And we didn't reach as far as, say, Apple did in terms of fundamentally reimagining what the device could be, not as a small PC, but a device category in its own right. And that's why a lot of the phones that carried the Windows Mobile operating system couldn't do the things that, say, the iPhone did. And so that's a case where enough risk wasn't taken, but it does point to another strength of Microsoft, was we really learned from that. And as opposed to finger pointing and trying to identify whose miss or failure it was, there was a real concerted effort to learn from what was working and to pivot. And we actually write about that a few times in the book, where the company has had misses. We weren't in front of the search revolution. We kind of went off, the right strategy with one of our Xbox launches. But there's this consistent capability to step back from that and say, we failed and we need to learn and we need to make changes. And that, I think, agility and ability to learn from failure is a big reason why the company keeps innovating.
And I'll add something that's not in the book, but it's in the bonus chapter that's coming out on the release date of the book. Okay. So anybody that is at our release party or is an insider in our community, which you can sign up on our website, will get a copy of this bonus chapter about the Microsoft Garage. And their keystone event is the hackathon. And I think a lot of people hear hackathon and they think, engineers having fun for a few days or a week, it's not for me. But the hackathon has been a critical element of the cultural shift in Microsoft from those, competitive guns pointing at each other of project versus project into, as we're moving the culture from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls, which takes time. Every one of our case studies said, this thing we did couldn't have happened in this context. We needed 5 to 7 years to get to this new state of being. Well, while that's happening slowly, the hackathon gives everyone in the company an opportunity every year to put all the fear aside, no career impacts, no reward impacts. It's just a week to collaborate on anything that you're passionate about and do it with people from all parts of the company, people you don't usually work with, in a structured process. So you're learning the innovation method by doing it with the help of the Garage staff. And then you get to see, like, there were 20,000 projects this past in the collective, and maybe 20 of them quote unquote win or move forward. So almost everybody quote unquote fails. And you get comfortable with that because you see that nobody's coming for you when your hypothesis didn't pan out or your prototype just wasn't enough. And so it's this muscle memory that you develop, which as an entrepreneur, I will definitely say 25 years in, and I can even count the 10 years before that because I started as a kid. You learn real fast that no is just no until you hear yes. And, it might be even a maybe. Like all of that muscle memory that innovators and entrepreneurs learn by doing things like hackathon, let everyone who doesn't quite think they're an innovator yet learn those things.
I love that. I think that's great. And I think the point about muscle memory is so important. So I do a lot of things to try to get people out of their heads and into some other space. And one of the exercises I do a lot is brand takeover, which is, let's say you work for, I'll make this up, General Mills or something, and you say to them, okay, you're going to get bought by Nike. What would they stop you doing? What would they encourage you to do? And if they increased your marketing budget by 10x, how would that look? And what I find is it liberates people from the constraints, whether they're real or whether they're made up, that people carry in their heads. And it says, oh, well, if I was Nike, here's all the cool stuff I could do. And it just sort of puts them in. And it strikes me that hackathon may be something along those lines.
Yeah,
absolutely. Something we write about in the book is, the process for innovation is you have to think divergently for a period of time, then converge, and then synthesize. The problem with being in a big corporation, to JoAnn's analogy of a river, the corporation just wants to converge, right? It wants to do things efficiently, quickly, repeatably, in standardized ways. And so you have to create space, exactly as you do with your seminars, Rita. You have to create space to diverge and think more, openly and in new directions. And hackathon is exactly designed for that. We used to have a think week where everyone was encouraged to write a paper and send it in to Bill Gates. Would review them personally. He would, take a week of his own and review. So creating those spaces where people can open their mind and think in new ways is absolutely critical.
I like that. The other thing that to me goes with it is something you talk about, which is the idea of principles, not instructions, design principles. So instead of spelling out what people are supposed to do, they say, well, here's what good would look like, right? Here's the outcome. Now, with that in mind, how might we get towards that? I wonder if you might elaborate on that.
Well, why don't you take that, JoAnn?
Yeah, it really comes from the design world. Engineers, we're taught to define requirements, and our product managers and program managers give us specifications, right? And they're very detailed and very specific. Designers who are taught to imagine all the ways something may be solved, again, they appreciate, they're taught to have some sort of constraint. You don't want to go, analysis paralysis and just wandering instead of, moving. And so they have these tools called design principles. And I like the analogy of directions. It's in the book, we use this analogy of an engineer will tell you precisely how to get home. Right? If we will give you instructions like turn left, go a mile, get on the highway, drive a car, all of it, like we'll be very specific. Designers will say, get home or get home safely. They'll qualify it to some extent, give color to it and the value underneath of it, but they're not going to tell you the method. And so what that does is it just gives you guardrails as you put ideas on the board. And that's another part of it is instead of starting with one idea, you really like Dean said, step back and diverge from that idea and think how else, or what else, or why might, or who might, and you just go as wide as you can and fill your board up with as many different things as possible. But then those principles say, oh, that one doesn't live up to principle number 2. But if we combine it with this one over here, it does. And now you start that combining and refining. And I call it wiggling. You take this big board and you kind of just start wiggling your way through it. And you may have started down in the left corner with your first idea, and you end up in the upper right corner by the end of it because you've taken the time to look at it from a lot of different angles.
There's actually, there's a great anecdote in the book. It was when Office was doing their transformation to become an AI first, organization. One of the things they did was they had historically had what's called a triad. For every product or feature, you would have a program manager, a developer, and a tester. And that's just how product got built. And they inserted a design person into that structure. So for everything they were working on, there was now a design person from the very beginning to kind of set those principles and bring that design thinking in. And it was a huge part of how they transformed their product.
One of the things I thought was interesting, just using the Office example, because firms don't do this, is awareness that you can overshoot what your customer needs, wants, or can absorb. And so this principle of, no, we're not adding new features. We're just not doing that. And that is so antithetical to what an engineering mindset often wants to do, right? You want to add new features, add new functions. It's got to be new and improved. It's got to be better. And the Office people took a contrarian perspective on that. And I thought that was interesting. Most companies don't have a great way of dealing with overshooting.
I don't know if you remember this, Dean, but you didn't believe it in the interview when we interviewed Sumit, when we were writing up that chapter. And we love, like, Sumit was at the panel on Tuesday, and we brought it up again. No new features, one click to stunning. And she's great at these like rally cries. But when we were writing up this chapter, and I added that in at some point, Dean's like, are you sure? Are you sure she said no new features? And I was like, let's go back to the recording. Let's go back to the transcript. And we checked it like 9 times, emailed her. Like, it was so hard to believe that this product that has, I forget how many tens of millions of people using it, and, the money behind it. And she's like, no, stop.
And when we analyzed that with her a little bit more deeply, it was super interesting, was that historically they had sold Office to the procurement office in a large corporation. And it was a boxed software. It went out on disks. And so it was great to have hundreds of features as bullet points on the back of the box and on the marketing materials. When they pivoted to a subscription model, now it's all about usage and people getting value out of the software. But it took a very explicit executive directive to say, we're in a new world, we have a new customer, we're going to cater to their needs, and there's enough features. It's more about getting them to use the ones that we have. So the history of that is interesting, and also reminds me that we once were a bit bricks and mortar company. We ship boxes and discs and things, and that's a part of our history as well that shaped us and that we've had to react to in some ways.
Yeah, some people talk about unlearning and
yes.
Beyond. So I'd love to talk about responsible AI, but before we get there, because I think this is a huge topic, everybody's kind of concerned about it. But before we get there, I'd love to get your perspective on the transition when Satya came in, and just to share my background with Microsoft. So for years, I was part of the Microsoft CEO Design Summit, beginning in the Bill Gates era and continuing through much of the Ballmer era. I was involved in teaching in the company. I was part of what they call the member bench and the leader bench programs. And so over the many years, had a lot of experiences with Microsoft. And what I would observe at that time was it was just famously internally competitive. I mean, it was a hugely high performance culture. So absolutely high competence, high performance, but also incredibly competitive. I mean, everybody had to have the last word, be the smartest person in the room. It was and the leaders kind of, you get them all together and they'd all be kind of eyeing each other. And from what I gather now, it's a very different place. And it'd be fascinating to hear how that transition felt.
Yeah, I joined at the peak of that, I think, competitive era, and it was a shock to me. There's the famous, cartoon with the Microsoft org chart with guns pointing at each other's head, which felt right on the mark. And what's interesting as a manager, I knew what would be the worst day of every year, and it was a day we called Calibration. And it was the day that all the managers in a group would go into a room and we would have to stack rank every employee in the organization on a scale of 1 to 5. And it was a forced curve. So if someone was going to get a high review, someone else had to get a low review. And it wasn't just me stack ranking my own people, it was done across teams. So for one day every year, every one of your peers became a competitor for resources and status in these rankings. And it was a system that was well-intentioned. It was intended to drive performance. It had its usefulness when it came in. But one of the very first things that Satya did was to get rid of that. And it was one of the happiest days, I think, in the company's history when we learned that was going away. And what he did was not only to take out that element, which was making us more competitive, but to replace it with something very positive. In fact, two things. One was he really started speaking publicly and broadly and passionately about the growth mindset. And you could tell that it was not only the right thing for the company, but something he believed deeply in. And then they made real fundamental changes to the system. So when we write our reviews at the end of the year, we write what we delivered. We're given a 3-part framework. What did you deliver? How did you build on the work of others? And how did you contribute to the work of others? And those are considered co-equal in terms of their impact for the company. So I think that combination of talking about the growth mindset and then embedding aspects of it in the systems that we were using really helped the company to transition in ways that I wouldn't have thought was possible before.
I wouldn't have thought either. I mean, if you had said to me back when I was working with the company, oh, this is a company that's going to be all about, helping each other and collaborating, I would have been like, whoa. Well, what was also interesting to me was that the technical people that I worked with were often like that. Like, if I was working on my computer and something would go wrong, they'd all be like, oh, let me look at that. That's super interesting. Why did that? It was all very, and then you get to the commercial side of the house and it was like velociraptors. I mean, it was just, so that transition has been absolutely stunning. In case you're just joining us, I'm here with JoAnn Garbin and Dean Carignan and about their terrific book, The Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft. So let's talk a little bit about what you call responsible AI, because I know in the world right now there's this huge excitement about AI, but also huge concern about it being misused, about it being parlayed into misinformation, cybercrime, you name it. And it's very powerful. And like any powerful tool, it can be used for good or it can be used for not so good. So what's your take on how that?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll definitely want JoAnn to build, because we really broaden it a little bit in terms of responsible innovation. And within that, we talk about things like responsible AI, obviously, but also privacy, security, accessibility, and sustainability are kind of our 5 pillars. And the real motivation for writing about that is that a lot of tech culture grew up in an era that tech companies were small and not influential. And, Mark Zuckerberg famously said, move fast and break things. And that's fine if you're a company of 10 or 20 or 30 people. When you have the reach and influence of big tech, it's not fine. So what we tried to talk about in that chapter was, is it possible to move fast without breaking things? And what are the practices and patterns and things that allow you to do that. One of the things I'll speak about AI specifically, because I think it's unique in that it's in this moment where I don't think we've ever seen a science that moves as fast as AI and yet transitions into the company as fast as it does. We have no time to kind of let it mature and incubate in the lab. It comes out every month. There's a new model or a new capability. So some of the things we've done at Microsoft is to really think about having very defined and very agile process for how we can receive, let's say, a new model or a new capability, run a battery of tests and evaluations, understand how safe it is, build mitigations, things that make it safer, and then do these staged rollouts where we get it to a very small group to see how it performs in the wild, get it to a slightly larger group, and release broadly only when we feel it's completely safe for the public. And what's interesting about that process, like all innovation, we've turned it into a loop, because every time we run it, we learn something new. So even our policy now is part of that loop, because we'll learn something new and we'll need to create policy. So as opposed to policy being this linear process, it's part of this learning loop. And we have this incredible cross-disciplinary team that involves legal and compliance and product and research and others. And so it's far from perfect, and we're always trying to make it better. But turning kind of risk assessment and mitigation into a loopy process that just runs over and over has been, I think, a big part of what we've tried to do.
And I'll expand to something more foundational of what we took away from studying privacy, accessibility, and the other pillars, including sustainability. When we take compliance and risk and shift it left in the innovation process and make it yet another set of lenses that we're exploring opportunities from and challenges from, instead of trying to treat them as outputs, like we need this to be private, we need this to be sustainable. When we use that as, how might this be private? How might this be sustainable? Use it as an input in the process. Now you not only bake in the results, if you've defined your guiding principles to hold steady to those aims, you can solve in much more novel ways. It points you at different outcomes than you would if you were like, I want to create generative AI. Oh, and then after the fact, I want to make sure it doesn't do anything I don't want it to do. Bake those values into the guiding principles of being private and accessible and secure and sustainable. And now the first ideas you have and you put on the board, you're going to say, that has the potential to not be private when it comes out. So let's shift a little and solve it a different way. And now your code looks different. Your infrastructure looks different. And the really cool thing, and the CFOs and CEOs should love this, is you take compliance and you bake it into something that has a return on investment. So instead of having another cost on your sheets, now your risk and your sustainability and all of these things become value creators. And so when you partner all of these disciplines together at the start of innovation, you come up with more robust, novel, competitive, and trustworthy results.
And maybe to apply that even back to AI again, there's this one principle that has really helped us. It's the principle of human-centered AI. And that basically starts with the question, not what can AI do, but what should AI do? Yeah. What are the uses that are safe, that are helpful, that are complementary to human skills and not a replacement for human skills? And when you kind of flip, the lens and look at it through that perspective, you're just much more likely to start with scenarios and use cases that are going to end well. And not all of the industry has that human-centered view. I'm glad that we do here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I think that's fascinating. And, and the question always comes up is, well, in a competitive space, if you're, I'll say, adding that layer of thoughtfulness to your products, does it run the risk of someone who doesn't have that point of view taking advantage in some way?
It is one of our greatest fears, yeah. And what we have decided is, as a company, it's not a trade-off we're willing to make. We will put the investment in the risk analysis and risk mitigation, teams and organizations, so that we can keep moving fast and still be innovative and still be safe.
Yep.
Big tech, I think, is kind of following our lead slowly, or picking up some of our practices. I think the startup scene scares me a little more, because the startups are often more willing to just get something out there and try to run with it. But for now, yeah, we're very committed to moving fast without breaking things and remaining competitive. But yes, it's not easy by any stretch.
I want to defend the startup world here. And this is the fun thing about me and Dean being together, because we do have these different backgrounds.
Yeah.
I would say I'm not concerned so much about the startup world. Like, just look at the rise of B Corps. Over the last 10 years, we went from 200 B Corps to almost 10,000. So building benefit into the structure of the corporation. I would say the problem is in the equity world, private and venture cap. As long as the money is flowing into startups that don't consider these things and don't represent the values of the communities that they're serving, we're going to end up with half-baked products that do unintended things and avoidable things that just weren't thought about. We got to change where the money is flowing. The startup community, there's no shortage in my network of startups that want to do what Microsoft is doing at scale, and they don't have the access.
Yeah, and I think especially private equity. I see glimmers of hope there. So if I look at what KKR is doing with companies like CHI Overhead Doors, just as an example, where the first thing they did was they took a longer time horizon. So this is a company in the middle of Ohio, I think it is, that makes overhead doors. So it's not a glam high-tech company, but what Pete Stavros, who was the managing director there in charge of this investment, did at the outset was he wanted all the employees, even the hourly workers on the front lines, to have an equity stake in the company. They structured it as an employee-owned company, an ESOP. And when they had an exit, so they bought the company for about $500 million. I think they sold it to Nucor for $3 billion, but it took 9 years. And the average payday for an hourly person is $176,000, depending on their tenure and how long they've been there. So that's stunning, right? So private equity can be a force for good, but a lot of times they're just extractive. I look at private equity in healthcare and it gives me the creeps. Just why? Why is private equity getting involved in care industries? That's a whole other conversation.
Can I just add one more thing, since we're here, and let's get this message out there. I will also say the market, us, people, consumers, the people who Microsoft and everybody else is building for, we're building for them. That's all of us. And in 2012, you may even know him, Rita, Carrie Krasinski and I launched a platform to help everyday investors connect their retirement portfolio with values. And this was 2012. And I kid you not, the response from the people with the money, the capital, was, oh, that's a niche. That'll never be anything. No. And we showed them the data about women and the next couple generations and about all of these people that are like, I don't put my money into things I don't care about because I want to, but just because I don't have any other option. And so now, fast forward 12, 13 years, it's $1 trillion market.
Mhm.
So the signals are all there. It's I coach CEOs and CFOs on the premise of, you don't have to do this, but you're going to lose. Like, the market couldn't be clearer about what it wants, and it's only a matter of time before you lose.
You know, one of the most interesting things I've been studying is by 2030, so we're talking 5 years from now, just in historical terms, not a very long time, there's going to be something like $30 trillion of wealth that's basically transferring from men to women. And it's because you got this whole generation where the men typically marry women who are a little younger than they are, and the women outlive the men by longer. So, you know, just demographics, it's not a big mystery. But what we do know is women invest very differently than men do. They're looking for different outcomes. They're looking for different impact. And I think a lot of our financial services professional organizations are not very well prepared for this, and it's going to come pretty fast, and I think it's going to take them by surprise. So I do see a lot of like green shoots out there that we're really moving from this very financially mobilized economy to something that's different. And we got very financialized for you know, I would say since the 80s. There's really been this huge pressure on the short-term financial primacy of what organizations' goals are. And I'm very hopeful that we can start to, not that finance isn't important, and I believe in capitalism, and I think there's one of the best systems that we need to have, but it can't just all be, you know, red and claw and tooth and nail. It's got to have a human dimension to it, in my opinion. So Satya Nadella very famously, very recently, basically had an interview where he said that, you know, software as we know it is eventually going to go away. And it's all going to be these agentic AI programs pulling data from wherever it lives and actually performing tasks for you. And the analogy I would use to just try to explain to regular people what that means is, you know, if you go back to Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
When Captain Kirk wanted to give the Starship command, he didn't haul out his laptop and start calculating on an Excel. He told the computer what he wanted to do.
Right.
And I guess that's the image that we're thinking of. So could you speculate a little on is that world really coming? Because people like Mark Benioff of Salesforce said that's not the real world. We don't believe in that. I'd be fascinated.
Oh, famous last words.
Exactly. Yeah. Just to say a few things about agents, and I'm doing research, working with some folks researching them now. It really is. I mean, agents have been with us for a while. The idea that there's a piece of software that does work on your behalf, that's not entirely new. What is new is the fact that you can talk to those agents in natural language, right? Most of the agents that are out there today have sort of two components. One is they have a large language model backing them, so you can type or speak to it and you can give it instructions. And then it has some ability to generate code that goes off and does something, whether that's browsing the web or, you know, maybe looking up some information, running a search. And so I think that is, and then the fact that in many scenarios, the agents talk to each other in natural language, which has often been a barrier to agents in the past, is one company's agents might have one communication protocol and another company's, you know, might have another. But the fact that they all can communicate through natural language and have language models behind them, I think it really does put us in a position to do something fundamentally different, where you'll have an agent that you communicate with. It will control a fleet of other agents that then might be accessing software applications on your behalf, or functionality from software applications, or maybe even writing a bit of code to do something new. And then that can all be brought back to you and presented to you in natural language. So I do think we've hit kind of a minor paradigm shift there. We work a lot on the safety aspects of these agents, making sure they have guardrails and limitations on what they can and cannot do. That's going to be a very important area of investment. But for me, if I could get out of the world of hitting Alt-Tab between applications and jumping and just, you know, work through a single interface, I think that's very compelling and very achievable.
And it represents a philosophical shift. There aren't a lot of people talking about the fifth industrial revolution, more today than a couple years ago. But as you know, the data center of the future leader at Microsoft for a few years there, we're like, well, we're not designing for the fourth industrial revolution. We're designing for the fifth. So we looked out to see what the philosophers and the futurists were talking about. And the best summation of the philosophy was the fifth industrial revolution is when we bend technology back to the service of life. And I find that so beautiful. Just, you know, just like in capitalism, we've lost the path of the network effect and the ecosystem of small businesses, trading, and all of that. We also kind of lost the thread on the point of technology. Technology was not the definition of the word. And I'm sorry, I'm a philosophy nerd. You know, so looking at the etymology of words and stuff, technology is there. It's to make something better. It's to improve. It's intrinsically supposed to be helpful. So it doesn't help us to design things that put people out of work in large swaths or block people out of economic prosperity, you know, and make it narrower. So this fifth industrial revolution, and I love how Satya talks about the democratization of innovation. Agents are the thing that can take a first-year engineer and help them perform like a 10-year engineer. They're the thing that can help a finance person collaborate in real time with a biologist and with an artist and with a musician. We have the ability to not only just replicate what the humans are doing right now, we have the ability to create digital partners that enable every single one of us to quickly explore what is of interest and value to us and ask it tons of questions and then turn those questions into ideas and then prototype those and draw them and imagine them and then put them out into the world and put them in people's hands so that we test them. Opening up that work stream to anybody that has the courage to just log in and try it, that I think is the fifth industrial revolution. Because now, instead of a few hundred people thousand people at Microsoft and a few 100,000 people at Google deciding what tools and what applications and what businesses we have in the world, with a phone, you'll be able to connect into the world economy and participate in meaningful ways and solve the problems that are valuable to you in your context.
I think that's marvelous. So one of the things that I've been working on, and I'm working on another book, which is taking a lot longer than I had hoped, but this happens, right? And one of the things that I've been very intrigued by is this transition from economies that have been delivered like massive amounts of prosperity to billions of humans, but you know, it's around cars, fossil fuels, mass production, huge organized corporations. And we're really in this transition to what maybe you call it the fifth industrial revolution, but this transition to digitally enabled, dematerialized experiences in many cases where you don't need a device to get the outcome that you're looking for. And this idea of kind of hyper-localisation is something that people are very interested in. And this notion that anybody, no matter where they are, if they had access to the internet through satellites, balloons, or who knows what the technology is going to be, but that they can actually create these really local things and be connected to the larger economic ecosystem, where right now people are shut off. And so the analogy is a little bit like when cars were first available to the masses, it created enormous value in land that was too far away from a railway station to really participate in the economy. And I think we could see a similar explosion of value in this brave new world. So it's exciting to talk to you about that.
I'll just give you one personal anecdote that I love is my 11-year-old son really likes to write stories and create, and he uses ChatGPT as kind of a writing coach now. He'll kind of come up with the storyline, and when he's stuck, he'll ask for sort of some kind of guidance or ideas, or he'll get the outline maybe from ChatGPT and start writing. And his skill has really accelerated, and it's something he finds fun and he's creating. And I didn't even encourage him to do it. He just got on my laptop one night and started working on it. So I think those kind of enabling experiences are quite profound with AI, just because it is so approachable. To build on JoAnn's idea, I actually feel like the AI revolution was the one where technology reached out to us as opposed to us trying to become better at using technology. So
I love that. That's amazing. Well, the time has flown, and I want to respect what I asked of you. So, for our listeners, we've been talking about this terrific new book, the Insider's Guide to Innovation at Microsoft, with co-authors JoAnn Garbin and Dean Carignan. Just as a reminder, if you do buy the book, the proceeds from its sales will go to support STEAM education, as you call it. And where can people go to learn more? So, the book comes out soon, right?
Yes.
Yeah, February 18th is the official release date, and we'll be in New York City that week. Hopefully, we'll see you.
I would love to
Microsoft Garage. Yeah. And you can go to innovation@microsoft.com. We have a page up that explains who's in the book, what stories are in the book, all the great early praise for the book, so that it's not just us saying it's a good book. And a lot of different options on where you can buy it.
That's fantastic.
And we are available for pre-order already with the formal launch on February 18th.
Yes, and Kindle and audio are coming. So.
That's great. Well, as I said, to me, just personally, for those of our listeners, the transformation in this company has been just stunning. And I think this book kind of gives you a front row seat at how that actually happened. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for joining me. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the book makes its way into the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah.
Thank you.